today. I'm Rich Hansen, VP Business Development for People Science. That's me, obviously, in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. To get started, there have been, since we released the letter RPO, RPI versus Contingent Staffing comparison, several questions. So we decided to do this webinar in an effort to answer some of these questions. So I would like to introduce Christine Nicholas, our CEO, to lead us through the webinar and discuss some of these questions.
Thank you, Rich, and good afternoon to our friends in the East Coast, and hope you're having a nice lunch in the West Coast, and good morning to our friends, or actually Central, and good morning to our friends on the West Coast. So as Rich said, when we put this paper out, RPO, RPI versus contingent staffing, a comparison about 3 weeks ago, we received a lot of questions, a lot of good dialogue. So we decided to do this webinar to answer some of those questions directly and hopefully to engage some of you with interest. If you have more questions, and also your comments are always welcome. So we think it's an interesting topic. We're glad you found it interesting and hope that we can give you some answers. So we're going to do a short presentation, and then we're going to go right to questions. But what we've done is compiled some of the key questions, or the questions most often posed. What is RPO anyway? We do different programs about RPO, explaining it. So we're going to give you a brief snapshot of what RPO is anyway. What is RPI exactly? Good question, because it is a new acronym, and there's so many acronyms right now in talent acquisition. So we'll talk about what recruitment process insourcing is. Isn't direct hire or contingent staffing the same as RPO? And that's where we're going to start to look at the comparison. And how do I know which service is best for me? So we thought we'd give you some key questions that you can ask. Before we get started, I just want to explain that I am the founder and owner of People Science. And People Science started as a talent acquisition consulting company, so we would take a look at talent acquisition, make recommendations. We wound up also having a contingent side of the house that does contract and direct hire staffing services, but probably the largest and most well-known side of the house these days is People Science, the RPO side. So we have 3 different buckets. The questions that have come from our client base and consultants in the arena and some of our friends in the industry. We wrote this really because of what we're hearing from all sides of the house. So from the staffing side or the contingent staffing side, from the RPO side, and from the consulting side, about how did these two measure up and what are the differences. So just so you understand the context of the paper and who the contributors are. So how are we defining contingent staffing? So for the sake of explanation, we thought it would be a good idea to define our version of what is contingent staffing. So the first bucket on that is direct hires executive search, formerly known as perm placement. So direct hires meaning you're looking for a candidate. You go out to a recruiting agency or a recruiter specifically. Typically, you're paying a percentage of their salary, sometimes a retainer. They find you a candidate, you make the hire, on we go. Under contingent, we're also wrapping contract workers, professionals that work typically at an hourly rate or on some type of contract. Could be a monthly contract, could be a weekly arrangement. Contract worker services fall under the contingent label for us as well. About contract workers, too, we are talking about internal contract workers on 1099s as well as those that fall under the agency's labels. Temporary to hire services and temp services. So that's how we're defining contingent staffing. That's what we consider in that one large title. So one of the big questions that we repeatedly get, and we've been getting for years now actually, is aren't all of these outsourced recruiting? People Science would answer yes. I think we're always curious to hear what you have to say and what your comments are about it, but we would arguably say that these are forms of outsourcing. Not recruitment process outsourcing or recruitment process insourcing, but definitely a type of recruiting outsourced. So an overview of RPO and RPI. RPO is a new concept in outsourcing, relatively new. So we've been doing RPO work since the late 1990s. We know other people who started mid-90s, maybe early 90s, different forms. Not too many companies, not too many of these arrangements early on. In 2005, we were approached, and a couple of recruiters actually came to me and said, hey, we think we're one of the largest RPOs in the country. And I was like, great, what's an RPO? So that was in 2005. And it's been interesting now to watch what's going on with RPO. But it's still, in our mind and in many of the customers out there, still a new concept and a new idea. I would say it's kind of secondary right now in the overall talent acquisition space to vendor management systems and MSPs, managed service providers, as far as picking up in popularity. However, it solves a lot of problems that were previously not necessarily solvable, that staffing and contingent companies couldn't. And it does take a wider, more in-depth version and have a different type of solution as compared to the staffing side. So we'll take a look at that. Like HRO, Human Resource Outsourcing, RPO assumes the responsibility of the HR function, but specifically as it relates to recruitment. Sometimes it's easier to explain RPO by saying, in the human resource outsourcing arena, you saw things like your payroll system. So rather than manage your own payroll, you decided to outsource it to an outsourcing company. So RPO, like HRO, is where you're outsourcing the recruiting part of your HR function. Recruitment process outsourcing is a quickly growing avenue for sourcing and retaining top talent. It is growing quickly, very quickly. In fact, I saw some writing yesterday, for the sake of explanation, it is early May 2014. This was some writing yesterday talking about RPO being targeted as a $15 billion industry by the end of 2017. Interesting number. I think 12 billion is something that I heard before. Even more interesting is, what are we counting as RPO? But we are seeing it grow quite quickly, and a lot of interest in what it is and how it operates. And as RPO is growing, we're seeing it kind of spin off into different versions of RPO. So we'll talk a little bit about that. RPO takes over, to some degree, if not completely, the responsibility for an entire segment of recruiting, or in some cases, the complete recruiting effort for an entire company. This is the best description that we can come up with so far, so we're going to start talking about how we look at it and define it. So this is the recruiting continuum. For those of you who have not seen it, this is the cornerstone of our analysis process of talent acquisition. Actually, the recruiting continuum came about in late 1999, 2000. What had happened is we had one engagement, a recruitment process, now known as a recruitment process outsourcing partnership. And when that came to the end, because it was a short-term, what would now be called on-demand, it was a year-long contract to get a company into a certain position. The powers that be said to us, you know, you did your job with this. Why couldn't we do this ourselves, and why were you successful? So we said, that's a good question. You have your own internal resources. Why were we successful where they hadn't been? And we laid flat recruiting, and that became what we now today call the recruiting continuum. So the recruiting continuum is all the segments of talent acquisition that happen. The degree to which they are measured, monitored, and adjusted decides how efficient the entire continuum is. And then how efficient the entire continuum is decides what the results will be. So, for example, these buckets always happen. You're always defining and attracting. You're recruiting. You're interviewing. You're always processing your candidates, and you're always collecting data. So let's say, for example, I'm ABC Trucking Company, and I want to recruit Rich Hansen, our moderator. So I define and attract myself by saying, I'm ABC Company, we have an opening, Rich. And then I say, Rich, would you be interested in this opening? Now I'm recruiting him. I interview him by saying, you know, do you know how to run a warehouse? He says, yes. I decide to offer him. Do you want a job? Now I'm in the offering mode. He starts. I show him his desk, show him where the men's room is. I go back to his manager later to say, how is he performing? He says, I like Rich. He seems to be doing pretty good in my opinion. And then we talk to others about Rich, and everybody likes him, so the general consensus is Rich is doing a good job. Throughout this process, candidate processing would be my conversations with him. I write his name down on a napkin, put it in my back pocket, use it on my desk. Data collection and reporting would be my memory recollection, or maybe an Excel spreadsheet that I'm keeping track of. So that all of these pieces happen. So raising the efficiencies, being cognizant of them, is of these buckets and how they operate and the effect that they have is what causes the efficiency level of the recruiting effort. Okay. So what is RPO anyway? The degree in which the RPO takes over is dependent on each partnership and is typically based on the client company's strengths and talents as described in this graph. So we like this graph. As you can see, it represents many of those pieces of the continuum that we just talked about. The purple part of the graph represents a client company. This is an actual client of ours. And so when we came in to do an analysis, working side by side with them, we came up with these grades. So you'll see in advertising, they graded themselves below the 50% mark. It's probably around 25%. In recruiting, they said they were even lower. Now, keep in mind, this is for a particular segment within the organization that they were struggling with. And I will say at the same time, towards the end of our presentation, we show you our URL where you can go to People Science and you can actually measure your own success for your entire organization or a segment using the buckets of the continuum, and it'll populate a graph like this for you. It's completely confidential. Not even People Science can see it, and it's a good practice piece that I think a lot of our clients go to when they're struggling. It helps you get out of the actual task of recruiting or looking, kind of close to the grindstone, takes you 50 feet up and lets you take a look at your recruiting and say, okay, what are the pieces that we're doing well? And in these pieces that we're doing well, what is the talent set that I have in my company that I can utilize to train to raise the efficiencies? And if I don't have that, then what is it that I need to go to either a contingent company or an RPO, or what can an outside force bring to the table for me? So a good place to start is, what is it that I have inside and what can I train to? At the same time, what am I going to need to go outside? What does it make more sense to go outside? So if you start with the continuum and you start looking at a graph like this, a good place to start. And RPO being born of this takes a holistic look. So back to the continuum. Okay. So what is RPI exactly? RPI, recruitment process insourcing, is a term that's really beginning to catch on quickly. The term insourcing, as compared to outsourcing, calls for a more inclusive partnership, right? I think one of the biggest obstacles we face when it comes to starting to implement or meeting with many different levels of management and many different levels of talent acquisition professionals, the term outsourcing is scary. When you mention outsourcing, I think people visualize all types of things. Their call centers offshore, answering questions, taking over their job. Am I going to be dismissed? Where do I fit into this equation? Is my job being outsourced? So the term outsourcing itself can be misleading, especially when it comes to what we call modern-day RPO or RPI, because quite often that isn't the case, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the term RPI lends itself to a different kind of partnership. RPI typically defines a partnership that is structured for greater sharing of responsibilities. So when RPO was originally founded and consulting houses were brought in predominantly, so if you were doing payroll for an organization, they said, hey, maybe I can outsource my recruiting to you. It was kind of a boxed solution, right? So I turn the keys of the kingdom of recruiting over to you. You take over, and here's your KPIs, and here's what you're going to do for us, and here's what we're going to do for you, and out it goes. RPI really is indicative of, as I said, a more modern RPO, and it's structured for greater sharing of responsibilities. Some of these, and many of these box solutions that came out 10 or 12 years ago did not succeed. And in our experience, the reason that they did not succeed is because it was kind of a turnkey. Take it and we're out of the equation. And recruiting just is not simply process. The word recruiting is in there because it does involve a lot of involvement. Recruiting for your company, attracting talent to your company is as personal as you can get in business, because it's an intimate relationship. So as we see RPO becoming more advanced, we see the term RPI taking off even further. RPI typically involves augmented services as compared to that big box solution we just talked about. RPI can also be project-based. Originally when RPO came out, it was like, no, I'm not going to do this short-term for you. Now as it's evolved, we see companies saying, I'm going to open a division, or I have a need for an RPO for a short period of time, a year, 6 months, 2 months, whatever the case is. So we're seeing a lot of ingenuity in that space, and that typically falls under the RPI label. RPIs are usually more customized and based per customer need. So when you look at a large-scale RPO, you definitely want to evaluate, is this a box product? And for example, when you look at bringing an applicant tracking system in, you'll look at the applicant tracking system and you'll say, this is the system, and then they'll tell you, and here's how we can tweak it, and you'll say, well, I need it to be tweaked this way, and you're cognizant, you understand how you need it tweaked. You ask the applicant tracking system if they can do that. They say yes or no. It's the same thing with RPO. When you look at RPO, you want to look at the process, look at their models, look at what they're accustomed to doing, and then say, can they augment to what it is I need, and are they the right provider for me in that respect? And that's typically an RPI has more flexibility or denotes a company that's more flexible than necessarily a well-established box solution. So aren't RPO and RPI essentially the same thing? Yeah, they are. But again, I think RPI is differentiating itself because of that outsourced term, and also it's indicative of a little bit different type, more customized solution. Aren't contingent and RPO services the same anyway? Well, this is a question that we've had quite often, and one of the reasons we wrote this paper is to do this comparison to kind of show you an example. And based on this chart, again, this is another client that is actually on the RPO side. But when you take a look at this graph, this is exactly what a staffing company would do too, right? They advertise, they recruit, they pre-screen for a company, probably even some interviewing in there. And so their grid looks like this. In-house is kept here in the purple. Out-house is the agency. The surprising thing is this actually is an RPO customer of ours. But the partnership looks the same as it would if it was a staffing company when you look at it in black and white. In fact, it looks the same if you were to look at proposals. You're going to see a lot of the same services offered on both sides, which just makes it all so confusing. The difference is the degree of the responsibilities as a whole. So if we go back to the continuum, an RPO is going to come in and look at all of these pieces, how they plug in. And let's say, for example, we've got the term advertising up here, which fits under defining and attracting, right? So an RPO may even come in and refine the job descriptions. In almost every case, they're not going to advertise under a staffing company or the RPO's label. They're going to act as the client company, advertising under their label, working with their branding company, learning their brand, publicizing their brand, and working with it. So you can see the difference that way. So it's the degree to which the services are being performed, which on the RPO side are typically a lot more in depth, which is a good segue into the actual comparison grid that we have. So here's a side-by-side comparison of RPI, RPO versus contingent. On the RPO side, it's typically less expensive. On the contingent side, there's no placement, there's no fee. So your risk is a lot lower financially on the contingent side. You don't find the right candidate, you don't make the hire. On the RPO, RPI side, though, so if you have an initiative, and we're going to talk about how do you figure out if this is a solution for you, the RPO side, but if you determine that it is, in almost every case that we've seen in the 17 years we've been doing this, the RPO is almost always less expensive. Of course, it has to fit the model, but it's almost always less expensive than contingent. In fact, many contracts are drawn based on that. The RPI, RPO builds candidate relationships for the company as compared to the recruiter. The client company owns the candidate base. So the RPO partner does not own the candidate base. They might own the technology, but they don't own the candidate base. The candidate base belongs to the client, and the candidate base is always acted on behalf of the client. On the flip side, on the contingent side, they build the candidate relationships with the recruiters or with the recruiting company, and that company or that recruiter own the candidate base. On the RPI, RPO side, the data collected provides best practices, such as time to fill, recruitment roadblocks, both internal and external, just as if you were trying to, as a client customer, you were trying to collect this data for yourself internally. The RPO does that for you. On the contingent side, they're going to supply candidates, but typically not data, or maybe some data. What's interesting is we are seeing contingent companies trying to learn RPO and coming into the RPO segment that are collecting some of that data. But in most cases, that data belongs to the contingent company, isn't usually shared with you, and it's what the contingent company does to uses to enhance their relationships with all of their customers as compared specifically to the one customer. And best practices are usually about recruiting in the recruiting industry as compared to in-house recruiting for you as a company. RPO, RPI is compensated to act in your best interest. So the entire contract when it's done right, is based on working in your best interest. The RPI is motivated to work in your best interest to make sure that things are successful in your recruiting realm as a whole, whereas on the contingent side, they're compensated to make the hire. The RPI, RPO builds pipelines for future hires for the company, reduces time to fill, spreads your culture, and your recruiting message continuously. So just as the data is being collected in the same essence, so is building the pipelines and building your candidate relationships, whereas on the contingent side, again, it's being done for the recruiters, it's being done for the agency. On the RPI, RPO side, the guarantees for placements are at least 90 days or replace. I think what's interesting about this is even the amount of days that they guarantee become a moot point if your service level agreements state that you're going to reduce turnover. So as an RPO, in an RPO partnership, there's all types of service level agreements and KPIs that say this is what we're going to meet and this is what we're steering towards. So instead of steering towards a placement, which on the contingent side you're going to steer towards your placement and the length of time that the candidate stays in place, over on the RPO side, they're going to be looking at how long are they staying in general? What is what is the effect on the total outcome to the business of the candidates that we're providing? RPO, RPI, and the company have a shared interest protected by the RPO, RPI. So this is a shared interest that's determined early on. It's in the contract. It's understood. We're in this together. We're working for each other. The contingent relationship, by nature of what it is based on the recruiter's interest. Success based on recruiter's work as well as making the placement. So on the RPO side, it's the recruiting initiative is as important. How is the recruiting going? How is that continuum being optimized? Is just as important as making the placement. On the contingent side, the success is based on the client hiring the candidate and the candidate lasting through that guarantee period. And our last bucket talks about RPO pricing and what the samples of that are. So RPO typically has a straight, one of three, a straight monthly fee, a combination of monthly fees and per placement hires, per placement fees, or fees, and this has been the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen fees per placement. That's usually for very large situations. For example, we know some banking institutions that have tellers that are hiring maybe 7,000 or 8,000 hires a year globally, and an RPO partner might charge them a certain amount per hire. Now, at the same time, these contracts typically include the client company saying, yeah, we're going to pay you per hire, but we're going to guarantee you at least X amount of hires. So it's a little bit different. Now, because we're seeing some of these per hire fee models in RPO, it becomes even more confusing because that's exactly the way contingent works, right? It works based on, and typically a percentage of salary or retainer, but it works on the same model of a per hire fee. Direct hire, again, does not include all the services of RPO. It's not as in-depth as RPO, but sometimes the pricing looks a little bit the same. And of course, for contractors and temporary services, it's an hourly bill rate plus buyouts for conversions. Both of these can offer discounts based on volume, but you can see clearly that they are different. Okay. So how do I know which solution is best for me? Our two biggest questions are how much and how often do you use contingent staffing services? Because that, just exploring that is a great exercise in its own. And then the second is, what are all the reasons your company uses contingent staffing companies? So that's your two main questions. Let's separate it out with some specific questions that you consider. For the direct hire contingent side, what kind of positions are going contingent? You know, why are you using contingent companies? What are these positions about? Why are these positions, is it necessary to take them outside? Is it because you're hiring at the executive level 4 or 5 people a year? Then, you know, is that something that really warrants an RPO? Probably not. So you want to take a look first at the positions, and then you want to say, is this the type of position that fits the RPO model better than it does the contingent model, or vice versa? Is this spend coming from the business or from HR? A really important question. Who's taking accountability for this? And is purchasing involved? Like, where is this spend coming from? And who's saying, yeah, we need to spend because? is this part of a well-planned strategy? So have you done that work of taking the look from 50 feet and saying, according to our talent acquisition strategy, and many companies have stepped back and said it's strategic for us to have direct hire or contingent staffing in place. It's a part of our model, and we've reviewed it. At the same time, is there areas for are there areas to improve the strategy or not? So in contractors, temporary and temp to hire, are you using agencies to find hires? One of the reasons that we first wrote this paper is we were inspired by a couple different purchasing agents that we talked to, that now that they are measuring via vendor management systems that they've recently put in place or managed service providers that they've put in place, they're saying, holy cow, we have a big spend. So when we look at this, they're saying, why do we have this large spend? And are we using this to find hires is the question that you might want to ask yourself at this point. Because if you're using even part of your large contingent contract and temporary spend to find hires, that is a flag for us to say, is this something that should go RPO? Because if you're doing this because you just don't have the internal bandwidth or you don't have the type of or enough people internally to recruit for this yourself or the kind of relationships that you need, this is something that RPO might be able to bring to the table to resolve for you. Why is the need for the temporary or contractors? That's another good question. Would you fill the position if you had the right person? I like this question because every time I ask it, I'm always surprised by the answer. And it depends who you ask it to. But I've sat down with hiring managers and said, well, you're using a lot of contractors. Why are you using the contractors? And if you are, why, what if we could make a hire out of this? Do you really want to hire somebody? And some people right away say, yes, of course. And then other people say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I think of this as a contract, and then explaining their position. So you want to find out, and that has a lot to do with who you choose, if you choose to go contingent or you choose to look at an RPO, based on the hiring manager's sentiment or human resource and your recruiting team, whoever it is that you're talking to. Are these short or long-term contracts? So how long are they? If you're not going to need somebody long, maybe contract is a good idea. And is it specific for a project with a definitive ending date? So do you already know that you're going to be ending this, so you really don't want the liability of bringing somebody in, and you don't want the responsibility of that? What are your reasons on the temp to hire side? So these are the coined questions that we received ahead of time from you. I know that Rich and the staff here have been collecting other questions that have come in. So in the next few minutes, we're going to go ahead and address those questions. I'll turn this over to Rich.
Hello once again. Christine, the first question is, do RPOs run VMSs or are they managed service providers?
Do RPOs run VMSs or are they managed service providers? RPOs are not vendor management systems, VMSs, and they're not managed service providers. RPOs, if you can kind of visualize this, I'm sorry we don't have a slide to show it, but if you have a vendor management system, underneath it fits contingent, direct hire, the temporary to hire and contract workers. On the other side of the house, you have your own internal recruiting, and then you have RPO. So RPO sits outside of it in this particular model that we just described. Another way to look at it, and what we see especially with an enterprise solution, so if you brought an RPO in and they're going to run all of your recruiting, you could put underneath them your contingent recruiting, which means the RPO is now operating the vendor management system or acting as a managed service provider for your contingent staffing.
Okay, our next question is, how many positions do I have to have an RPO make sense?
How many positions do I have to have an RPO make sense? That's the question. If this was 5 years ago, I would say no RPO provider is going to, that has experience is going to look at anything under 300 positions. That absolutely is not the case anymore. I know from our standpoint, as RPO evolves and as customers start to look at different venues, RPO itself and RPI has become very customized. I've seen contracts that just have 10 or 12 people in them. It's interesting. and it all has to do with how it operates. I think the important thing is to take that glance backwards, look at where you are, and say, okay, these are the positions that we have in scope. We've got a big contingent spend, or we're just not doing what we need to do with them. Talk to, you're certainly, well, I'm sure that Rich will welcome the phone call. You can definitely give us a call, and we'll talk to you about your particular initiative, or talk to anybody who's a talent acquisition consultant, and they'll help explain to you if they think that there's somebody out there that fits your need. The important thing is to take that look and then say, hey, this is something I want to explore, and then get the right counsel to help you say, yeah, it's out there, or no, it's not.
Okay, we've gotten this question a few more times. So to clarify once again, Christine, can you elaborate what is the difference between an RPO and a VMS?
Okay. Recruitment process outsourcing and recruitment process insourcing involve taking your internal recruiting and using a company, an RPO or an RPI, to perform that for you, whereas a vendor management system manages your service agencies. So if you have a VMS in place, it has multiple agencies that are providing contract workers, temporary workers, and direct hires, and you're going that venue. So you're using contingent companies. The RPO sits on the other side and helps with your internal hiring from the RPO perspective, from the outside of the VMS. I hope that helps explain it.
Okay, here's a very specific question. I have a team of 4 internal recruiters, but we are missing the boat filling some positions. Can you help me and still keep my team intact?
Good question. And I can't help but think that that's one of the reasons the term RPI is better than RPO, because I think outsourcing, they should say, I have a team. What's going to happen to my team? Where's that team going to go? Do I have to lose the team? How does that work? I got to tell you, in 17 years of doing this, you don't always and most often do not lose your team. A team of 4 could be the plugins. In other words, they could be client service managers. I've seen events where that team actually becomes part of the RPO. I've seen that team, and I think some of the best work we've seen is an RPO comes in and your team becomes elevated. They actually become more strategic. They become the guy sitting at 50 feet and kind of managing things from a distance because they're no longer in the trenches. So with a team of 4, do you have to lose them, or is it worth it? It's definitely worth it to look at it. Are you going to lose them? You don't have to. There's no harm in making the call to see if this is something that's viable for you, especially if they're struggling.
Okay, and our final question. How difficult is it to implement an RPO?
How difficult is it to implement an RPO? Well, it depends on the size of the RPO. Implementation, though, especially for a large solution. So let's say you're looking to bring 4,000 hires, transfer 4,000 hires a year for a particular segment of the business into an RPO partnership. Well, you want a very thorough, well-planned implementation, and you want to do it with somebody who's done it before and can show you evidence of the fact that they've done it before. And you want to make sure that as many people as you can are in the boat as it's sailing through implementation. And particularly, I would say to client companies, you want to make sure that you're keeping a pulse on your internal staff, because there's so many people involved in transitioning. So if you've got 100 people involved in transitioning and 90 of them are okay or feeling good about the system, and you've got 10 squeaky wheels, they can really make it an even bumpier road. On the flip side of that, I've seen many transitions go really well, especially if you do a nice pilot early on. And if you stay away from that outsourced feeling, again, getting away from the term RPO outsourcing, RPI insourcing. We have a client company that was trying for years to bring in RPO. I was trying to bring us in for years and had trouble internally convincing hiring managers and a lot of the recruiting staff, but senior leadership was committed. So that particular organization helped us come up with what we call the advanced recruiter services. So the company was accustomed to having contract recruiters, but they knew that they needed a lot more than contract recruiter services. So we created a custom solution specifically to get them to the point where we could bring in a full-scale RPO. So Advanced Recruiter Services, not that you need another acronym, but actually takes the contract servicer and a contract recruiter and piles on top of it the services of the RPO till they're now operating that way. But the billing feels different, even though internally the client is talking to the same contract recruiters. Most of them, in this case, are not on-site. They're in our offices, and they're interfacing all the time with the client. So now that almost a year has gone by, the client feels comfortable, we feel comfortable, and we're going to go into what is a regular RPO model. It won't change a lot, the look and the feel, but the Advanced Recruiter Services, because they were comfortable with contract recruiting services, is a smoother transition into RPO. So we've had a lot of success with that. So as a whole, as RPO has been evolving, as talent acquisition keeps changing and becomes more and more sophisticated, there's a lot of different models, and there's a lot of different kinds of providers. So there very well could be a good provider out there for you, and transitioning and implementation are important, but I think these days it's come a long way. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rich. I think we're done with questions, so I'll thank everybody, and here's Rich.
Okay, so for more information or to access your recruiting effort, visit people-science.com or call me at 888-924-1004. And I look forward to hearing back from you and moving forward with your business. Bye now.